Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me from deep in the heart of the Bluegrass State is my friend Steve Phan. Steve, how are you today?
It's good to see you, my friend. It was sad to see that our teams weren't in the last game of the season for the NFL. Well, my team hasn't been in the playoffs for like 7 years, so it's been a while. How are you feeling post AFC division game?
Yeah, to be honest, I was telling people last night I'm disappointed that the Bills didn't win the Super Bowl tonight.
I saw your post. Yeah, so,
I mean, the fact that they weren't in the game still doesn't matter. I was still disappointed.
well, since I'm in Central Kentucky, we're relatively close to Cincinnati, only less than 2 hours away. So there's quite a bit of Cincinnati fans in the area, the region. One of my coworkers is a big Cincinnati season ticket holder, actually, and so yeah, they're going through a mourning period themselves. So
I understand, but they showed nothing but class when, of course, the Bills player had the heart attack on the
that's
field.
right. Yes.
And so hats off to Cincinnati. Hats off to Cincinnati. So you are just south of Lexington at a cool new park called Camp Nelson National Monument. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I guess it's new to the Park Service, Chris. This was declared as a unit of the National Park Service, a national monument in November of 2018, but it's been a county site for about 20 years. So in 1998, Jessamine County, Kentucky established this park, and it was known as Camp Nelson Heritage Park. And they managed this site for about 20 years. And Chris, you've been around the Park Service, you've been involved with the Park Service, worked for the Park Service, you kind of see how this works. A lot goes into, declaring sites, preserving land, of course, and infrastructure is a big thing, right? So we're fortunate that the county, with very minimal resources, was able to develop quite a bit here. Everything from the visitor center and the museum. They started doing renovation of one of the historic houses here, develop all the trail systems here. The interpretation here is actually pretty good as well. And, we're fortunate because the lead historian here is an archaeologist, and he did multiple excavations and surveys on the site as well. They actually rebuilt one of the fortifications and after doing a survey here. So a lot of what we know is from what basically the previous organization did. And so we're very fortunate, that this foundation has been built, and we're literally just building it up from there. And it's been exciting, to be at a brand new national park site, working with people from across the Park Service. And I think some Civil War people might know Ernie Price. He's our superintendent. He worked years as the chief of interp at Appomattox. And so, we were literally the first permanent park staff on the ground. We've been here for about a year and a half or so now. So, I like to tell people that we're making foundational decisions that will impact the park for decades. And, we don't take that lightly, of course. And it's quite the responsibility, but it's also very exciting to be a part of it as well.
Well, and you came to Camp Nelson from the Civil War defenses of Washington, which seemed to be a gig you were born to do, because, man, you made loving Civil War fortifications fun every single day. It's always been so great following. So what was it that attracted you to go to a new park from a position where
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Chris. I mean, I think people know me as a port person because by the time I spent about 4 years at the defenses, 5 years in total at DC. And I came to become, very passionate about the Civil War fortifications around DC because they told so many stories of so many different people and things like that. And it had to be a special place for me to leave. And I'll share a story with you. And I know a lot of the listeners, people involved with emerging Civil War, we all know each other, right? So they'll appreciate this. But when I told people that I was moving to Kentucky, they didn't believe me. They're like, there's no way you're leaving DC. And, people know obviously the food scene that I'm obsessed with there, and the culture especially. It was a lot of fun. I think one of my big things I really miss, to be honest with you, is the community there, right? Both professionally and then outside as well. I miss being like an hour and a half away from all these Civil War battlefields, right? And so obviously living in DC was great, but I love escaping every weekend or so, and I went to Gettysburg, Antietam, all those sites, Richmond and Fredericksburg, like literally once every other weekend or so, So I lived and worked in the city, which I love, but I also liked to get away. But it had to be a special place for me to leave that behind, right, and go somewhere else. And we're at again, a brand new national park site, and the story is incredibly compelling. And look forward to chatting with you about that today. But it's obviously the opportunity to be in this position as the chief of interpretation, work under someone as thoughtful and dynamic as Ernie Price, and then working at a brand new park site is really, really special. And then when I kind of talk more about what Camp Nelson is or what it was and what we're doing here now, I think people understand why several of us have moved across the country to be at this site.
Ernie's work in Appomattox was almost legendary. It was a longtime institution there. So being able to work with him, I'm sure, is a real treat.
It
so
is.
Go ahead.
And well, he's the first permanent superintendent here, right? And he was at Appomattox for years, and then he made this kind of late career move out to New Mexico just to kind of try something different. And then got this opportunity to be the superintendent at Camp Nelson, and this is his last job before he retires, and he's all in. So it's really exciting to work with someone as passionate as Ernie is, and someone that has a ton of experience as well. So I've never been in this type of leadership position before. So we're learning a lot from me. I'm learning a lot from him. So it's been truly a labor of love.
So brand new site for the National Park Service. I'm assuming a lot of people have never heard of Camp Nelson. I hadn't heard about it until you started to tell me about it.
Right.
Like,
Even
wow.
Civil War buffs, historians, enthusiasts don't know much about it. And it's not a battlefield site, right? There was not an engagement. There was a small skirmish that occurred near one of the bridges here. But you find a lot of kind of the undercurrent of the Civil War. You can kind of find the complexities of the Civil War, everything from, we're in the slave state of Kentucky that remained in the Union. Right? So we talk a lot about conditional unionism here, and what does emancipation mean in this state? What does it mean to be an enslaved African American in the state in 1863 and 1864 when things start changing? The war kind of takes this evolution, as we know. There's also like the logistics aspect of this, right? That's what Camp Nelson is. And I think people focus on the word camp, and it was obviously called Camp Nelson, but I describe it as a military installation. It is a massive military installation established by the U.S. Army in late April of 1863. And it's going to fuel this offensive into East Tennessee, which was under Confederate occupation. And there was a lot of Unionists in that region, right? Andrew Johnson, the future vice president, is from East Tennessee, and he becomes the military governor of Tennessee during the Civil War. And as early as the summer of 1861, East Tennesseans are calling for a military offensive to liberate them, to drive the Confederate forces out of East Tennessee. So you have all these kind of interesting allegiances, right? Based on economy, where people are located, and things like that. And I think sometimes people forget how divided loyalties were in some of these sections of the country. And believe it or not, it's none other than Ambrose Burnside of Fredericksburg, I would suppose infamy, that orders the establishment of this site. And it's going to be his Army of the Ohio that leads this offensive in August of 1863 from Camp Nelson. And so really unique connections, right? So we're going to talk obviously about the civilian aspect, the refugee enslavement, as I said, kind of the local politics, but also very big military campaign as well. And Camp Nelson has it all.
When you say camp, and you said that a lot of people are kind of dismissive of that, and first thing that came to my mind was Camp Curtin outside of Harrisburg, which was a massive installation, sort of used as a rallying point for soldiers coming in, training, equipping, logistics.
Exactly.
And it sounds like that's what you're kind
It's
of
similar. Yeah, there was actually about 9 miles south of us, right off what we call the Lexington-Danville Turnpike. It's US 27 today. In Garrett County was Camp Dick Robinson, and it was established really around May, the summer of 1861 by our namesake, General William Bull Nelson. It was like the first truly union recruiting and training center in the state of Kentucky. And I want the listeners to go check this out and read more about it. Kentucky was the governor when the war began did not send 75 part of the quota to for 75,000 volunteers from the federal government and things like that. And state legislator was kind of conflicted on what to do. There was a period when they were like Switzerland, we're going to be neutral. In a war like this, you can't be neutral, right? And so you've got Bull Nelson that starts establishing this training center just south of us, and it grew to perhaps 600 acres. It's pretty large, right? And they were issued arms there, and obviously loyal men would be organized into units and things like that. And it's a really interesting place, Chris, because Bull Nelson's there. William Sherman is there. George Thomas is there. In 1861, right? These are some really big Civil War names, right? But the thing was, as I said, the main objective was East Tennessee. They could never get into East Tennessee until 1863. And so, we've got the establishment of this base, which, Chris, grows to 4,000 acres during the Civil War. Includes all these military roads, of course, 300 wooden structures, earthworks that span the northern approaches to this site, a water system that pumps up water from the Kentucky River that's piped throughout the site here. So it was all for fueling the Army in the field, and it's absolutely spectacular what they were able to do here. And so we call it a 3-year city. The site is established in 1863, and really by the summer, you're going to see this massive buildup, all these structures and things go up, different workshops. There's a horse corrals and rehabilitation center, hospitals, of course, ordnance, all the things are being gathered up and even produced here in many ways. And Burnside himself arrives here from Cincinnati in early August. And then he's going to issue orders, and they're going to march directly down the road. And then in September is when they liberate Knoxville and the surrounding area. And so, when you think about a camp, I think people think about an encampment with a few soldiers here and there. No, this was a base, and we describe it as such.
How important was Camp Nelson in stabilizing Kentucky for the Northern effort? Because, of course, Lincoln famously says he's got to have Kentucky.
Right. I actually think that was already done in 1861 and 1862. And we had a very prominent Civil War historian actually present this past weekend, Stuart Sanders, and he's written he's written on Perryville, and he's written on Mill Springs as well, the other new National Park Service unit, which is about an hour and a half south of us in Somerset County. And that's from a January 1862 battle. Think about how early that is during the war. But he talks about the influence of Bull Nelson and his efforts to basically stabilize the state into the Union control, basically, right? By, and he went to, extra legal means to like arrest, pro-secessionists and things like that. But it was really the presence of the U.S. military in this region. The Department of the Ohio is in this area. So Cincinnati, Louisville is really the main hub, the headquarters of this major department, which includes like Michigan, Indiana, parts of Illinois, most of Kentucky. This is a huge department, right? And in 1862, and you've been out to these sites before, it was Perryville in the Battle of Richmond, right? Perryville being the largest battle that occurred in the state in October of 1862. It's a tactical U.S. victory with the multiple Confederate armies retreating from the state. And that's like the last major invasion of Kentucky, right? And so you're going to see some skirmishes over the next, 2 to 3 years. There's going to be a lot of guerrilla warfare. So it's going to get pretty deep and pretty bloody here. A lot of it will be the turn against emancipation. So Kentucky Unionists were pro-union because they thought that was the best way to protect slavery, that the U.S. Constitution was the best way to protect Kentucky. And they were very deliberate and very specific in that language throughout the Civil War. So, Kentuckians, especially politicians, were against any of Lincoln's military orders, first, second confiscation and things like that. And they were vehemently upset by the Emancipation Proclamation, even though it didn't directly impact the border states, right? Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and then Kentucky, but they felt it, right? And the idea that this war was starting to turn, you're going to see a major shift against the Lincoln administration, against the War Department, and then even the memory of the Civil War here. There's a very pro-Confederate memory, and it's because of emancipation.
I see that you've got some United States colored infantry in the picture behind you there. And you've said this to me before, that you've got a really rich emancipation story that's associated with what you do there. So how does emancipation unfold, and how does Camp Nelson sort of turn into a
Right.
fantastic
What's
little
really
epicenter
interesting,
for that?
yeah, it's as I said, it's incredibly, it's actually delayed by a full year. So, um, the word we always start with the emancipation. I like to start with that because a lot of people know about it. They know about Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, he's born in Kentucky, right? We have the Abraham Lincoln birth site, which is a national park site in Hodgenville, Kentucky. And I think, Chris, most people know like thenceforward and forever free, right? You think about this language in the Emancipation Proclamation, but at the end of it, it talks about, this authorizes the military to recruit African American soldiers. And so that's January of, we know, 63. By May of 63 is when the War Department organizes the Bureau of Colored Troops, right? And now you start seeing these units, the United States Colored Troops. Ones are all well over 100 USCT regiments, just infantry. That did not happen in Kentucky, and Camp Nelson is kind of caught up in the middle of this, right? Like, what do we do about this, right? We want to obviously keep Kentucky in the Union. We also want to ensure that there are these military bases that can field offensives and the armies in the field and things like that. So when Burnside orders the establishment of Camp Nelson in late April, there's not much happening here really until the summertime, but the African American connection is almost immediate, and this underlines the complexities of emancipation. The Army had to impress enslaved people to build fortifications and expand the road system in this area because they had no authority to confiscate enslaved people, right? This is not contraband of war like this, that the states are in rebellion, right? So we saw this a lot in DC, of course. Enslaved people from Virginia were, by the thousands coming into DC, and they were considered contraband of war, right? This is not the case in Kentucky. Slavery is still protected here. And so in order for the Army to, get this manpower, they had to pay for it. So the Army literally paid the slaveholders for the use of their human property. And so that's the way they were able to do it. So we have remnant earthworks all over the site here, and some of them that are in very good condition. And it was all created by or constructed by enslaved people, about 1,900 of them that were basically taken from their sites or their homes or their plantations, brought to Camp Nelson and other military sites to do labor, and then they were later returned. In time for the harvest, these are all in these contracts, right? There were a lot of Kentuckians that didn't even want this because even though they were getting compensated, they knew this could start, lead to, you're starting to chip away at this institution, right? And that actually does start happening. And actually, one of the most incredible things is we've identified about 99 of those men who later came back and enlisted in the U.S. Colored Troops. So that happens. But in 1863, as I said, there's this burgeoning military site here. It's really interesting. It's a recruiting center for 7 white regiments, actually, that will serve in the U.S. military, including men from East Tennessee that have fled Confederate occupation. And they're going to be joined, by the way, by their families. So Kentucky becomes a refugee state for white Unionists that are fleeing Confederate occupation, from being really just the war, right? I like to talk a lot about displacement, right? Just imagine how many people are moving because of the military, right? Because of military campaigns and all the things that are going on around them, right? And that changes in 1864 for African Americans, and Kentuckians are heavily resisting it. And the War Department just takes stronger and stronger measures to ensure that it actually happens.
So by the time that does start to happen,
Right.
what sort of role do the USCT then play based on a Camp Nelson?
Well, and the way it happened, as I said, there was a lot of resistance. And so one of the things the War Department used, it basically said this: the state of Kentucky is unable to fill their draft quotas of white soldiers. So we're going to start recruiting black soldiers. And you can imagine white Kentuckians were very upset by this. And they tried to resist. And then there was this idea that, well, this is a bit inevitable, so we should try to compromise with the federal government, with the War Department. And so there was this idea that compensation had to happen. And you have to compensate us for our human property, right? In some cases, that did happen in 1864 and 1865, actually up till 1866. And then there was this also the stipulation that, yep, you can recruit African-American men in Kentucky, but they can't wear uniforms and they can't be trained in the state. So you can imagine the War Department is like, yeah, we're not doing that. And by March, April, really into May is when all restrictions are lifted. And Camp Nelson is one of a dozen, literally 12 USCT recruitment sites across the state of Kentucky. This is being the largest for sure. Over 10,000 men organized into 8 USCT regiments, infantry, 4 infantry regiments, 2 heavy artillery, and believe it or not, even 2 cavalry units were organized as well, the 5th and 6th, which is pretty rare. There was less than 10 of those organized in the country during the war. The total number, and I've got this kind of seared in my mind now, 23,701 men from the state of Kentucky enlisted in the United States Colored Troops, right? That's a big number. And there's a large, more men that went to other states, including Tennessee, to enlist with the USCT, and then other men went north as well. This gets back to the east-west connection, right? The 114th and 116th are probably the most distinguished units of infantry here because they went and served with the Army of the James in Virginia. And one of them, obviously they took a part in the campaigns around Richmond and Petersburg. And we actually did this really cool USCT video. You can see it on our website, on our YouTube page as well. And we wanted to connect Kentucky, our site, with these other MPS sites, right? So we go to Richmond, and our friend Bert Dunkerley talks about these men arriving in Richmond, right? We go down to Petersburg, of course, and then we conclude at Appomattox, because one of those units goes all the way down to Appomattox and is involved in this, the final major campaign with these Eastern armies, right? And Bert makes this really great point. But within a year, these men went from being enslaved to being in the army to standing in review for the president of the U.S., right? Abraham Lincoln. That all happened within a year here. So incredible. And by the way, Chris, like a lot of these USCT units, they signed, 3-year enlistments starting in 1863 or 64. And that's why a lot of these units are kept around after the war as the white regiments are mustered out of service. So the 114th and the 116th go and serve in Texas on the Mexico border, right? As a part of this, kind of issue, the tension between France, right, with Austria, right? And then the United States and, the puppet emperor down there and things like that, Maximilian. So they're down there until 1867. That's how long these men are in uniform. And we found about several dozen of them actually enlisted in the regular army and became some of the first Buffalo soldiers, which by that point, in 1866, the army reorganizes and includes these segregated regular army regiments. So these are the first Buffalo soldiers. So I think a lot of people, there's, we've had people like, what's the difference between USCT and Buffalo soldiers, and the first and second generation were actually mostly USCT veterans or formerly enslaved people, right? So there's a legacy of military service there. And, like a lot of USCT troops, they did garrison duties, around the state, guarding bridges and fortifications and things like that. The 5th and 6th were involved in the Saltville campaigns in Western Virginia.
Oh, yeah.
Under Burbridge and things like that. Unfortunately, the 5th was involved in 2 massacres. At Saltville, some of their men were wounded and were murdered on the field. And there's this really, really sad account of them escorting a cattle train from Lexington to Louisville, and they're ambushed. And a lot of them were murdered on the spot. Not uncommon for African-American soldiers wearing these blue uniforms, right? The rules of war didn't really apply to them. And I must share, this is one of the coolest ones. There is one unit, Chris, the 124th United States Colored Infantry. And I just started going through the service records. I'm like, man, there's not a lot on this unit, right? And they happen to be an invalid regiment. An invalid regiment. So basically a veteran reserve corps troop of men. And the reason why A lot of the men were either too young or too old or unable to serve actively. But they realized that they sent these men out of the camp, that they could be arrested, they could be assaulted, they could be re-enslaved. And so they literally created this Black Invalid Regiment. Informally, they're like, send it to the Invalid Regiment. And for us hardcore Civil War enthusiasts, Adams County Historical Society, right there for Gettysburg, right? They posted this incredible photo of this gentleman who was at the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And he enlisted in the 124th at Camp Nelson. I think he was 15 years old.
Wow.
So he was this veteran, and I started searching these newspaper databases, right? And he was basically going to all these Civil War reunions and just showing up there, So we have him on our website, so go check him out. But yeah, he's wearing this pretty spiffy outfit, and he's there in the 1930s at the last major Civil War reunion with veterans at Gettysburg.
Wow. As you relay all these different threads and layers of history, I just marvel at this notion that you've got guys who are coming out of slavery, who
Right.
are in at the death of the Army of the Virginia. They're standing up for President Lincoln. They're helping open the West. I mean, that is some incredible history.
It is. And there's the other layer that we talk a lot about. As I mentioned, there were white refugees that came here in 1863 from mostly East Tennessee, other parts of Kentucky as well. And they were provided by the Army, right? They provided medical services, food, shelter, and things like that. The African American men, when they enlisted, they basically freed themselves, right? We call it self-emancipation by enlisting. But that was not the case for their family members or men that were unfit to serve, because slavery was still legal in Kentucky. And so you've got hundreds and then thousands of men coming to Camp Nelson, and they're joined by their families who are literally, they're called them refugees. And the Army doesn't know what to do with them, right? And so it becomes a humanitarian crisis. And, there's some officers that want to take care of them. There are some Black men who enlisted with the promise that they could take care of their families. So starting in 1864, really in the summertime, I think there's 7 or 8 what we call expulsions, where the Army forcibly removes Black refugees from this site. It's one of the darkest moments, truly, episodes of the Civil War. And the worst event occurred in November. During the midst of a winter storm, where over 400 were driven out, and all their housing material was piled up and just burned to the ground to make sure they didn't come back. And it literally, not literally, these people were family members of USCT. There were soldiers that were trying to, defend them, saying, "Hey, this is my daughter, this is my, my children, this is my wife," and things like that. It did not matter. 400 were driven out, and over 100 died as a result, as a direct result, and more died in the weeks and months to follow. But that was a national event. And, there were officers that were so upset with the commandant of this site that they wrote people back out east. They wrote the War Department directly. And the order was actually rescinded within a couple of days, but as you can imagine, it had its impact with all these people dying.
Yeah.
But there was a positive result from this tragedy. And in January of 1865, at Camp Nelson, the federal government authorizes the establishment of the Home for Colored Refugees, which is established at Camp Nelson and includes these huts and houses, row houses, but also a hospital and a school and religious services and a mess hall and all that things, right? And it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger because more and more refugees are coming into the state. And so the Home for Colored Refugees, that's literally the name of this place. That's the official name of it. Included, refugees from all over Central Kentucky. And in March of 1865, Congress passes legislations which emancipates the wives and children of African American soldiers across the country. A lot of this was impacted by what happened at Camp Nelson, right? That's why this site's so nationally significant. But I think it's important to share, Chris, that and I did this a lot in DC with some of the programming that I did. Slavery ended different parts of the country each day, right? If a person could self-emancipate, if they could go on the Union lines and were accepted, and obviously men could enlist and things like that. But Kentucky and Delaware resisted the 13th Amendment. They voted against the 13th Amendment. And so we've got Emancipation Proclamation, we've got Juneteenth Day, which is, the Emancipation Proclamation basically being enforced in Galveston, Texas, or the state of Texas. But there are still enslaved people in Kentucky and Delaware until December of 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified. And as I wanted to, and this will reinforce kind of the point here about how upset Kentuckians were with emancipation. Kentucky did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1976. Right.
Wow.
Right. And that's how dramatic this turn had been, right? And so, so that's why we talk about memory and legacy here, right? It was directly impacting. I mean, it really started happening during the war. That's why I mentioned, Chris, there was a major increase in guerrilla violence that started occurring in 1864 because of Black enlistment, right? So we talk a lot about the people that made it here, the soldiers, the men that became soldiers and the civilians, but there are countless others that were murdered on their way to Camp Nelson, right? And so, or re-enslaved, right? And so you can imagine there's a lot of complex layers here.
So one of your tasks as the founding chief of interpretation there has been to try to get your head and your arms around all of this history. What's been the challenge of that for you?
Wow, that's a really good question, Chris. And I think for a number of things, first of all, foremost, I think a lot of people know about us, right? And so it's kind of name recognition. And for example, in this area, the community, just directly south of us is Camp Nelson National Cemetery, which is administered by the VA, right? And it's still open. Come check it out. It's got a massive Civil War section, including 800 USCT, soldiers from Perryville, Richmond, and some of the actions that occurred across the state here. The thing was, there was actually a cemetery there during the Civil War, and they just called it Cemetery Number 2, and it was located near a hospital. So this is one of the rare sites where you see civilians buried. There was the civilian employees that worked at Camp Nelson who died that are buried at the cemetery. In 1866, the site's redesignated as a national cemetery. So we're intimately and historically connected, but obviously we're administered by two different agencies, right? And the cemetery is still open as well. But when people think about Camp Nelson, they think about the National Cemetery, right? And so we've got people that come and, they're going to services and things like that, and they'll show up at our visitor center, what, people call us throughout the week. So I'm really working on branding and getting our name out there, right? And then just actually right off the Kentucky River, Chris, just south of us and south of the cemetery, there's like an RV camp called like Camp Nelson, like the Camp Nelson RV camp, And so, yeah, people have called about that, not as much anymore, you know what I mean? But we want people to understand that this is a national park site, Kentuckians, especially the ones in the bluegrass region, there's a national park in your backyard, right? And so working on that. And then just, we've got more land that came in, so developing a new trail system and working on really big projects, right? And so I think as people know, me, Chris, I'm not the most patient person, and working in the federal government, like that doesn't really go hand in hand, right? And so, I try to focus on the things that I can control and that we can do in the park. But it's really exciting to see how much it's grown over the past year, and just enhancements as simple as knocking down this wall in the visitor center and putting a brand new front desk in, right? Getting new exhibits up on the wall, and enhancing exhibits in the museum. Working on, we replaced some of the waysides of the county that just because they were faded and things like that, and we have a huge wayside project coming. I'll show you. We've all seen these, like the park unigrid, right? The official unigrid. We have people email and write us about that every single week. We just got those printed. I worked with the Harpers Ferry Center, and then obviously internally with our own staff to write it, revise it multiple times, well over a dozen times. That I got the email last week, Chris, that they're currently being delivered to us now, right? So that's a really big moment for us, right? I think people saw on our social media pages, working with Eastern Nat, we just opened the park store. And that was a huge deal, right? And so obviously you can imagine a lot went into that. So one of the things I like to tell people is like, especially people that live locally and can commute often out here, I'm like, keep on coming out because there's a lot going on, right? And that includes developing more of a trail system to the south of us. This we acquired this when it became a national park site, so we've got more acreage that basically goes all the way up to the national cemetery. And that's where the heart of Camp Nelson is at. We call that the industrial warehouse district, right? That's why this site was established. And unsurprisingly, and I think people will be excited to hear this, we the trail system, and it all kind of made sense to us when we toured the grounds with this group from this team from Hartford Ferry as we're developing this wayside and trail plan. But we're following the corridors that were established by the Army 160 years ago because they knew what they were doing, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, we're basically following these historic roads. I'm like, yep. So, Chris, we're currently at like 5 miles of trails now. Within a few years, we want to have 10 miles total of trails at least.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? We're building a new site. It's a lot of fun.
So if someone wants to visit Camp Nelson, how do they find you?
Yeah, as I said, we're very prolific on social media, of course. Another thing I love to do, Chris, is, and people really enjoy this, is to provide updates of what's going on in the park, right? We have this historic structure, this house that was constructed in 1855. It served as officers' quarters for the Army during the Civil War. And it's in pretty rough shape, right? It's right off the highway when you come into the park, and everyone knows it as the White House, right? And so we've got like updates and a historic structures report that was going to be doing this over this next year, and all these other things that are going on. So yeah, just follow us on Facebook. I always say, look up Camp Nelson National Monument, look for the arrowhead here. Obviously go on our website, nps.gov/CANE, or Kane as we like to call it. And yeah, just reach out. I mean, you can share my information, Chris. They're more than welcome to reach out to us, and hope they can come out and see us at some time. If they can't make it here, call us on our social media pages and website and things like that. I wanted to share real quick, Chris.
Yeah.
We're commemorating the 160th at Camp Nelson, right? As I said, with these really great anniversary programs and events. And it really starts this year in 23, obviously with the establishment of the base. And it will conclude in 2026. So Camp Nelson was shut down by the military in 1866. So we've got 3 years of commemoration here. So we're really excited about that. And we've got speakers coming. We're doing this huge event in August, by the way. It will be the 160th Knoxville event. And it's going to be our biggest event of the year, August 12th and 13th, 2023. Come on out. On our pages, we list all of our programs and things like that. Believe this or not, and I know you'll appreciate this, Chris, the one and only Bill Marvel is coming out to Camp Nelson in late March to speak on Ambrose Burnside.
Wow.
So you can imagine I'm absolutely thrilled about that. I know Bill going back for a few years now, and it took a little, tweaking out to get him out here. But yeah, he's coming out in late March, literally the same week that Burnside accepted command of the Department of Ohio. Will be presenting on Burnside. So big happenings at this monument, my friend.
Oh, very good. Well, thanks for all you're doing to get it up and going and making it such a dynamic place. It's an exciting story, and I appreciate you telling a little bit about it to us today.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the time. Of course, it's always good to see you, my friend. And as I mentioned, one final, kind of do this blurb shout out. There's a lot to see Civil War wise in Kentucky, right? So there's us. Mill Springs Battlefield National Monument is the other new national park site. I said battle from January of 1862. There's also Abraham Lincoln Birthplace. Those are the 3 national park sites that are Civil War. But there's the Richmond Battlefield. There's Perryville, which you've been to before, a spectacular site. Up in Lexington, there is the Meriton Lincoln House, right? In Lexington Cemetery, John Hunt Morgan's buried there. The Todds are buried there.
John Breckinridge.
Yes, John Breckinridge is there, and Gordon Granger, the general that issued the Juneteenth order in Texas, is also buried there as well. So, and there's fortifications, and there's really great sites all over the state. So, I see this as a Civil War corridor, truly, that's comparable to some of the other states that we focus on so much, like Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolinas. So, come out and see us. We'll look forward to having you here. And there's bourbon everywhere and horses, you know, so you can do all three and learn history as well. So come out and see us.
Steve, thanks so much for spending some
You're the
time with us.
best, Chris. See you soon,
Hey,
buddy.
Take care. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We will see you online and on the battlefield.
Cheers.